This is David Barton. If you're unfamiliar, he's most famous probably for eroding the wall between church and state, doing everything he can to erase it, trying to break it down. He's a Christian nationalist to the core, and he's a propagandist. And a lot of far-right figures use his propaganda in their speeches and on Twitter and other places. So let's talk about the type of propaganda that he promotes, that he comes up with and encourages. Listen to this. This is from late January 2021, where he lays out the basic response when people criticize others for being homophobic or for being anti-LGBT.
We're getting attacked because you love Trump and you're a cult for Trump.
Absolutely true.
What happens is you cannot back away from engaging in the debate. This is where you run to the roar. And if they want to call me a homophobe, I say, oh, so you're a heterophobe, are you? Just turn it back in the other direction. And so you've got this bias against heterosexual people.
That is the basic idea behind the current Republican strategy at this moment. Anytime they are accused of anything, turn it back around. Point it in the other direction. Oh, you're a homophobe. Well, you're a heterophobe.
You can't disengage from the debate just because they're being mean or just because they're saying things about you.
That seems pretty simple, but he's actually been laying out the framework for a lot of the propaganda methods used in the Republican Party. I've got a bunch of examples. Listen to this one. This is him reframing the Civil War and the way people look at it. He claims to be a historian. In reality, he's not. He has a bachelor's degree at some Christian university, not even related to history. It's related to Bible something or other. He's not a historian by any stretch of the imagination, but he claims to be, and the right embraces him as such because he tells them the things that they want to hear. Listen to how he frames the Civil War.
The northern states were very anti-slavery because they were very Bible-oriented. The southern states were very Christian-professing, but they didn't know much about the Bible, and they didn't read it much. They just professed to be Christians.
You got to be joking. He completely misunderstands the situation entirely, claims to be a historian. He is one of those people who isn't really in the public face as much as somebody like Donald Trump or Kenneth Copeland or whatever, but he pulls all the levers behind the scenes. For example, he runs, or ran at least, a super PAC for Ted Cruz. Now, if you're unfamiliar, a super PAC is basically an organization that is technically unaffiliated with any political candidate. Legally has to be unaffiliated. Candidates are only allowed to take a certain amount in donations per year. They're only allowed to take a certain amount from certain people. You're not allowed to donate more than, say, $10,000 per candidate. There are a lot of rules and regulations about how much money political candidates are allowed to take in, okay? So the way they get around that is by creating a super PAC. Like I said, they are completely uninvolved technically. The candidates themselves have nothing to do with this super PAC. It's just a group of guys that really like Ted Cruz or Donald Trump and maybe collect a whole bunch of money from gullible suckers to advertise for them. There are basically no rules about how much a super PAC is allowed to collect from people and what they're allowed to do with it. So in 2016, before Trump won the primary to be the nominee to be president, David Barton was the leader of a super PAC for Ted Cruz. He was like the owner that controlled it and everything. That is how high up this guy was, okay? Or is. That's how high up he is. I'm not sure what happened to the super PAC at this moment. It may still exist in some form. I'm really not sure, but just bear with me through this story, okay? After Ted Cruz lost the primary to Donald Trump, after Trump officially became the Republican nominee for president in 2016, that super PAC switched from supporting Ted Cruz to supporting Donald Trump. That happens from time to time. A lot of the super PACs that were behind a specific candidate in the primaries align behind the party nominee to make sure that the party wins ultimately, right? This happens in a lot of cases. So anyways, they aligned behind Donald Trump, and David Barton became one of the most powerful people in politics as a result, because he was behind Donald Trump's largest super PAC, or one of his largest super PACs. I think he has 4 of them now. So anyways, David Barton is not a nobody. He may not have a public face all the time everywhere. You may not have heard of him, I don't know. But he's extremely powerful. And he is the driving force behind propaganda for Christian nationalism, trying to break down that wall of church-state separation desperately. And what we just heard him say a minute ago about slave owners not reading the Bible and not really being biblical people, that's complete nonsense. It's revisionist history. This is what he does. He just makes things up completely. Whatever fits his worldview best, he goes with that. And he gets out here in front of crowds and spreads it. The South actually used the Bible to justify slavery, and it was pretty easy to do. The Bible explicitly encourages and endorses slavery. So I'm honestly not sure where he's getting the idea that the North were the biblical ones and the South were not. That's complete nonsense. The South was and still is known for their religious extremism. And trust me, they used the Bible to their advantage to those ends a lot. So anyway, the guy has no qualifications to call himself a historian, and he calls himself that anyways. Bear with me through this. Listen to what he has to say here early December 2021. This should form out his Christian nationalist ideals pretty clearly. Listen to this one.
The greatest people killer of all has been government. Nothing has killed more people than government has killed. And so when you look at that, the Founding Fathers believed that the people should be able to have enough arms in place to be able to remind their government, you don't want to mess with us. You don't want to come after us. Well,
Okay, so what he said there, nobody is killed more than government. I guess that would depend on what you mean by government. Do you mean just like an organization that has organized a military to take military action? Like, what does he even mean? This is what propaganda is. This is how it works. He'll do anything he can to make you believe that Christianity is right, that the Founding Fathers were all ultra-evangelical Christian nutcases, not true, obviously, and that libertarian ideals are best. He hates the government. This guy does. In fact, he doesn't just hate the government. He's like an ANCAP. There's libertarian, and then there's one step past that, which is an anarcho-capitalist, where people believe that government just shouldn't exist at all, and we should exist as basically like a governmentless society where corporations would step in and make things happen or step in and take control of the things that government was previously doing, basically. He's an extreme libertarian, extreme Christian nationalist. He's way out there. And if you're not sure if you believe that yet, listen to the rest of this recording.
Well, if all we've got is pea shooters and they've got 50 caliber machine guns, that's not the point of the First Amendment.
Okay, so the argument that he's making here is the Second Amendment was intended to stop a rogue government or a tyrannical government. That's not actually what it was for. The Second Amendment was intended to allow states to have their own militias so that they could make sure that slaves stayed in line and things like that. But okay, he wants to have an army or be capable of building an army that is capable of facing down the U.S. government. Well, the U.S. government has nukes. So what are you going to do then?
Because they point out consistently, Patrick Henry and George Mason and others, that the greatest threat to your loss of guns will come from government, not from criminals or others. And so they were very adamant that you be able to have that, which is why we see in Boston, they didn't care if you have a cannon. You can have a cannon, but please don't shoot it in town or within a mile of town. It's just so loud. I mean, it wasn't the fact of having a cannon. It was just, it's a little loud just to be shooting off just for fun.
Complete nonsense. He has no idea what he's talking about, first of all. Or maybe he does know exactly what he's talking about and is intentionally misleading people. Basically, everything out of the guy's mouth is twisted, nonsensical propaganda. Remember a minute ago, I laid out an argument that completely shuts this down, that the U.S. government has nukes? This is where he addresses that criticism.
Just to be shooting off just for fun. So in the same way, I don't want to see my neighbor stockpile nuclear bombs. Yeah, I don't want to see it, but I don't care if he has one because he should have the same rights. But you're saying, well, I don't think private citizens should have nuclear weapons.
That's insane. That is insane. This guy wants people to be able to own nuclear weapons. Anybody, just the random guy down the street should be allowed to own a nuclear weapon. And you know why he thinks it would be perfectly safe for people to own nuclear weapons? There is this concept of non-aggression within libertarian circles. They believe that people are generally not aggressive to each other and would be able to maintain a society with no government because people are not aggressive to each other. They would follow this rule of non-aggression. But aside from just that, he believes that in this perfect society, this utopia that he intends to build, everybody would be a Christian. Everyone would be Christian and thus trustworthy. If they weren't a Christian, they couldn't live there. So not only does he want an anarcho-capitalist state with no government, this is not a nobody, remember. This guy leads the super PAC, or leads a super PAC that started out for Ted Cruz and is now funding Donald Trump's ads, that funds Donald Trump himself. This guy controls a lot of money, a lot of influence. He has lobbied the government and has built lobbying arms. He knows what he's doing, and he's extremely influential, and he gives talks at churches all the time and on televangelist networks constantly. This is the system he wants. He wants a state with no government that is entirely Christian, where weapons up to and including nukes are allowed for anybody to own.
But if you've been trained with responsibility and morality and the concept of when and where you use them.
There you go. Responsibility and morality. That's the Christian aspect to it.
Founding fathers are trained extensively in the concept of defensive warfare. You don't start anything. Now, if somebody else starts it, you can take it on, but you don't start it.
That's the non-aggression philosophy that I was talking about a second ago.
You don't start it. I don't care if my neighbor has a nuclear weapon as long as he has that defensive concept that he will never use that unless it's being used against him.
And how do you know that he'll have that defensive concept? Because he's a Christian. That's how this works. Completely ignoring the fact that the vast majority of prisoners in the United States are Christian. The atheist population in the prison system in the U.S. is like 0.5% or 1% or something like that. It's so incredibly tiny. Protestant is 28.7%, Catholic is 24%, Muslim is 8.5%, Native Americans 3.1%, Pagan 2%, Jewish 1.7%, Churches of Christ 1.5%, Buddhist 1%, Jehovah's Witnesses 0.7%. What? That's crazy. Seventh-day Adventist, 0.3. Mormon, 0.3. Eastern Orthodox, 0.2. Apostolic, 0.2. So most of these are Christian denominations, right? The only ones that aren't are like Muslim, Native American, Pagan, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, Atheist, and Sikh. The rest of these are all Christian denominations, and atheists make up 0.1% of the prison population in the U.S. 0.1. The vast majority of the prison population in the U.S. is Christian, so I don't know what leads this guy to the conclusion that the world would be a better place if it was 100% Christians. So yeah, that's David Barton. He is desperate to convince people around him that he is correct, that we need a Christian nationalist ethno-state, effectively. An anarcho-capitalist libertarian hellscape is what he's shooting for, and it's deeply disturbing on so many levels. It's ridiculous. Before we continue, I just wanted to mention something. If you like what I do and you want to see me continue to do it, you can support me in a few ways. First, there's Patreon. That's probably the best way. But if you want to get something back for your support, you can check out my Teespring, or you can check out my Telltale Unfiltered channel. I go through long-form, unhinged sermons from all kinds of people, from Hank Kunneman to Greg Locke to Jehovah's Witnesses. So give it a look. Links are in the description. Okay, now back to the video. Listen to this one. This is an example of him completely twisting history around and misrepresenting it in every way. This is early February 2022.
See, God has a lot to say about economics. You know that God talks about what we call the capital gains tax? The Bible also talks about...
No, it doesn't. You know why? Because it didn't exist at the time. In no way, shape, or form did capital gains have any chance of existing back then. The capital gains tax, let me just define it for you. Capital gains tax is the tax on profits realized on the sale of a non-inventory asset. The most common capital gains are realized from sale of stocks, bonds, precious metals, real estate, and property. So here's an example for you with capital gains. Say you invest, I don't know, $50,000 into Twitter. So you buy, what is Twitter even worth? I don't know. $50 a share or something. So you just buy 1,000 shares of Twitter, right? You wait 2 years, you sit on that, and now it's worth $70 a share. So that's $20,000 profit. But you don't have to sell that immediately. You can just keep sitting on it. And as long as you don't sell it, it's considered an asset. When you sell it, that's called realizing the gains. If you don't sell it, it could go all the way up to $70 a share, and then it could drop to $15 a share for all you know, and then you've lost money. Net lost money, right? That's why it's not usually taxed until you realize the gains, until you actually sell some of the shares to receive the profits from it. So capital gains is a tax that I think it's set to 15% in the US right now. Capital gains tax rate is 0%, 15%, or 20% on most assets held for longer than a year. Capital gains tax on assets held for a year or less correspond to ordinary income tax brackets. Okay, there you go. There's the answer. I think at one point, capital gains used to just be a flat 15%. It was a way to incentivize people to invest and save, basically. Well, anyway, it's a very complicated system that didn't exist until fairly recently, relatively. The New York Stock Exchange wasn't created until May 17th, 1792. I'm not sure if that's the first stock market. I think the first stock market may have been from 1602. Not 100% sure on that exactly, but the point is, there was no stock market 6,000 years ago when this guy's talking about, or I don't know, 3,000 years ago. There's no stock market when the Bible was being written is the point, which is the point he's trying to make out.
That God talks about what we call the capital gains tax.
No, God does not talk about the capital gains tax. You see what he just did? I had to go through like 5 minutes of explanation to debunk something that took him 30 seconds to say, or even less. That's the nature of propaganda. Throw out as many ridiculous claims as you can, as quickly as possible, to as many people as you can, to convince them of as many of your ideas as you possibly can, because it'll take longer than anybody has to undo the damage that you can do in such a short amount of time.
The Bible also talks about things like the estate tax, the inheritance tax. It talks about
I'm skeptical.
Progressive taxes, talks about flat taxes, talks about capitation taxes.
Yeah, I don't think any of this is true. I think he's completely making this up. Of course, he's not citing any sources for us, so we have no reason to believe it until he does.
The Bible has so much on economics. It's interesting, even as Jesus and Peter were talking, and Jesus said, Peter, he said, tell me, who pays taxes, the children or the foreigners? And Peter said, oh, that's easy. Children don't pay taxes. It's the foreigners that pay taxes. Really? Yeah, see, that's why.
Okay, Again, I don't know how true that is. I don't even remember that verse. Maybe it is true. But guess what? They had a completely different system set up back then than we have today. First of all, they didn't have 350 million people in their little province, in their little area, their country. Everything the guy says is built on faulty premises. It's all ridiculous from the ground up, but it doesn't matter. He says it, and his gullible audience believes him. Something people don't really understand about the tax system, and not just that, but like a lot of big systems. I learned this when I was a software engineer, like especially coding systems. You can't just start with something, this tiny little thing, and then expand it out into a gigantic thing like that. Like, things don't scale that easily. You have to like structure them to scale. So what he's talking about here is Jesus living in an area where there was a flat tax, or they taxed the foreigners or whatever else. Yeah, that may have worked, if that's even true. That may have worked for a little tiny province where Jesus lived with a certain number of people. How many? I don't know. Thousands maybe? A few thousand? It would not work in a country of 350 million. It just wouldn't. And we don't need to take David Barton's word for this, or my word. We have economists who study this stuff, who understand tax law and regulation and economics and political science better than any of us could possibly understand. But David Barton doesn't look to any of them for answers, Doesn't even care. What he cares about is spreading the word of Jesus, claiming he's a fake historian, and propagandizing to people. That's it.
In early America, you didn't tax the citizens. There was no direct taxes. We had to alter the Constitution to be able to tax you directly because we had...
Okay, that does not sound right to me. Again, this guy just propagandizes and lies about all kinds of stuff. I'm not even sure if that's true.
Because we had all the taxes on the foreigners. We had all the tariffs and all the different ways of taxing the things that came from the outside, not the inside. Well, that was a tax piece of policy out of the Bible. What an amazing thing that would be to go back to that.
Okay, that's fascinating. So what he's recommending here is anything that comes into the country, we tax those people through a tariff. So if we want to buy something from China, China ships over a big old shipping container full of like little grass skirt hula girls that sit on people's dashboards or whatever, right? And they're like $3 each. So what he's proposing is we pay China for those things and then charge them a tax for sending it into our country. You know what happens then? Tariffs are not paid by the Chinese or whoever is producing this stuff. They are paid by Americans. They're paid by us. And we have to raise the prices on goods that we sell to others. He thinks he's getting one over or found a loophole into fixing tax policy by just charging Chinese for like through tariffs or whatever. That's not how it works at all. Like I said, the dude has a bachelor's degree from some Christian university. What is his degree? He has a Bachelor of Arts degree in religious education from Oral Roberts University in 1976. A 4-year bachelor degree in religious education. No joke. He's pretending to know what he's talking about when it comes to tax policy, economics, political science. He has no idea what he's talking about. Check this one out. Early October 2022 is a reasonably new video.
He told the people that if you want to know what the law is, go ask the priest. And it wasn't just the ecclesiastical law, it was every aspect of the law. And that's the way the American founding was, what I showed you this morning when...
Okay, it's interesting what he's saying here. So he says people used to ask the priest about the law. Are we talking the Christian priest? I mean, there are some circumstances in which the Catholic Church ran entire towns. That was actually really common a long time ago. The Catholic Church would run towns, and that's where excommunication came from. That's where the concept of it came from. The idea was if somebody breaks one of the church's rules, that you're not supposed to fornicate or something like that, the entire church, not just the church, but the town, because remember, the entire town is part of this church, they would all excommunicate this person together. Nobody would rent to them. They couldn't buy food at the grocery store. They couldn't buy horses. They couldn't buy grain. They couldn't nothing. The hope is that they would just wander into the woods and die. That's the idea behind excommunication. So in some circumstances, at one point in history, a very dark point in history, churches used to run towns. Is that what he's talking about? He most definitely wants to go back to the point in time that I just described. He is a Christian nationalist. That's the goal. I'm just not sure if that's the time he was specifically referring to here.
This morning when John Adams said, where do we get our ideas? He pointed to pastors.
John Adams, very specifically, was one of the most religious founding fathers. He was not a good person, honestly, at all. He fought tooth and nail to get religious extremism fit into the country, and many of the other founding fathers refused to go along with it. Thomas Jefferson was not religious, really, at all. He created the Jefferson Bible, where he basically cut out any mentions of magical thinking or whatever. I mean, Thomas Paine was a huge proponent of secularism, very anti-Christian nationalism. And there were a bunch of non-religious founding fathers who did everything they could to fight Christian nationalism. There are not very many Christian extremist founding fathers, but that's the one that you can really pick out of a crowd, John Adams, and that's the one he talks about constantly, honestly.
Pastors, it's not just the conversion stuff, it's the discipleship stuff. And I really encourage you to be broad-minded in that. All it means, the legal stuff as well. There's just a whole lot there. People need to go to you to find out what the law means and what the law says. Not just the Bible law, but every law that's out there. We're the ones that have the best perspective on it.
We're the ones that have the best perspective on it. Christians, is what he's saying. He wants a Christian nationalist state. That's what he's shooting for. That's what he's always wanted. At least since the 90s. That's when I first saw him appear on the scenes. I'm sure he's been doing this since he got his degree in religious whatever it was back in 1976. But that's what it's all about for this guy, turning this into a Christian nationalist state. And as I said earlier, we know exactly how that turns out. When a religion controls a state, it leads to authoritarian, top-down control. It is not good. By its very nature, religions are authoritarian top-down structures. And that's okay in some situations. You know, companies are also authoritarian top-down hierarchies. There's one guy at the top, the owner, who calls all the shots and controls everything, makes all the decisions and stuff. That's how companies operate. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have small pieces of society operate that way, as long as people are free to exit those things if they want. You can't exit the government if it turns into an authoritarian hellscape. This guy saw authoritarianism and fascism and said, yeah, let's have some of that. I love that. That's what he's shooting for now. It's deeply disturbing. And if I hadn't made it clear before, he's an extremely influential person, and he has been for decades. If you disagree with anything I've said in this, let me know in the comments or on Twitter @TelltaleAtheist.